morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Oraculos True Divination podcast, where I bring you ancient wisdom for the modern mystic. I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, and joining me today, all the way from Singapore, is Dr. Stephen Skinner. Stephen, thank you so much for being here.
Good to be here.
Stephen, I am really excited about the conversation that we're going to be diving in today. But before we get there, for those of our listeners who this is your first time joining us here on the Oraculos True Divination podcast, this is a podcast where I bring you interviews from astrologers all around the world who aren't just changing their own lives through their astrological practice, but they're also actively impacting this field of astrology that we know and love. However, for this month of October, we are running a celebration of magic for the entire month here on the True Divination podcast, where we're interviewing not just astrologers, but also people who represent other components of the Western magical tradition. So if you want to be a part of the magic and the momentum that we're building here on the Oraculos True Divination podcast, this celebratory month of magic, and for all months to come, please do take a moment, go down below, like this video, but also subscribe to the Oraculos True Divination podcast and hit the notification bell so that you receive notifications of when I bring you these interviews each and every week. Now, Stephen, thank you once again so much for being here. I know that we are on two completely different time zones, but we made it.
But we're also, both of us, virtually on the equator. So.
I'm really happy to be able to sit here and speak with you because your work has been such a mammoth contribution to the field of Western magic for decades. And I know this evening we're going to be specifically going down a very particular path in terms of the work that you've done with geomancy. But before we get there, Stephen, I want to give you the opportunity to tell our listeners who it is you are and also where it is your desire to deepen your understanding of the Western magical tradition has taken you.
Well, I guess for as long as I can remember, but certainly since my early teens, I've been interested in magic. I always thought it can't be all this smoke without a little bit of fire. It can't all be just fairy tales. Somebody at some stage must have done this stuff. And so that's been my primary quest, finding out the methods that the magicians actually used. I'm not interested in where they fitted in sociologically or what their religious views were or anything like that. I just wanted to know, how does it work? And so I've spent a long time, more than 50 years, digging in old manuscripts written by the magicians themselves. Not stuff written about them, but written by them. In other words, the grimoires. And so at a very early stage, I suppose I was a bit spoiled. I had space to try these things out. And the first one I tried out, the first successful one I tried out, I was only 16. But I'd reached university by that stage. So I thought, yeah, I can explore this. And I got a manifestation. And after that, I thought, okay, I just want to know everything about how this works. So that was the beginning. Now, in the course of this, I came across things like the Golden Dawn. And amongst their practices was geomancy, which I guess we're going to talk about in greater detail later. So I wrote, I wrote a couple of books on geomancy, and one of the publishers wrote back to me and said, you haven't included Chinese geomancy. And I said, what is that? And I discovered that he was talking about feng shui, but he didn't know, because one of the early missionaries back in about 1887 mistranslated feng shui as geomancy. And so certainly here where I live in Singapore, some of the local feng shui practitioners have got geomancy up on their windows. Because one of the things I love about this part of Asia is that there's no hesitation about saying what you do. If you're a feng shui master, you say so. Um, Down the lane from here, there's one of the local bomas, and he's got his sign up in English, he's got his sign up in Chinese, and he's also got some magical characters because he's a magician for hire and he does stuff and people pay him. And believe me, in this community here, if it didn't work, he would soon be out of business. So this is one of the reasons I live in Singapore, because people here are much more open-minded. It's not a Christian country. It's predominantly Buddhist and Taoist. And the Taoists are quite interesting because they have a style of magic which I find quite fascinating. Anyway, I'm getting off the topic now. So two main streams in my life have been working on how and why feng shui works and the methods of magic. Yeah, so my interest has been two-pronged. One is feng shui, which I got into by accident because of a misuse of word, and the other one was magic. But the prime core of my thinking is, does it work? If it doesn't work, I wouldn't bother with it. And I have found that feng shui works quite well for a lot of material things. A lot of people think they can use magic to make lots of money and so forth. In fact, feng shui done properly will do that for you with no problem at all. And with magic, you can do all the other very interesting things.
Okay, Stephen. So as we begin to go down this very spiraling magical path, give us your definition of exactly what you think magic is after your years of practice.
Okay, so people like Aleister Crowley describe magic as in terms of will and things like this, uh, because he fluctuated between thinking of magic as something to do with spirits or something to do with psychology and willpower and so forth. The truth is that magic, you and I as human beings cannot do really magical things. You can sit on a mountain for 40 years and you will finish up doing mystical things and stuff with your soul and your spirit. But if you want to actually make changes in the outside world and do magic, then you need to invoke and get the help of spirits. Because this sounds a bit wacky, but spirits exist and they can do things that you and I cannot do. So you get one of these and you instruct them and you get them to do stuff, and then it works. It's like spirits, a bit like wild animals. A human being can't run at 30 miles an hour, but if he can tame a horse, then he can ride at 30 miles an hour or whatever. So they can do things that we can't do, but they need to be tamed in the same way. And the methods for taming spirits are the methods of magic. And they've been around for a long time. But because, certainly in the West, because of, shall I say it, church persecution, most of this material has been lost or burned. Both the books and the practitioners have been burned. And I have been keen on digging it up. And for this, I've gone to the trouble of reading stuff written 1,000 years ago on parchment in Latin, with much stress and strain. But having decoded it, as it were, then I find in there methods which I can use and experiment with and work. So basically, my attitude is a scientific one. Discover the method, test the method, do experimentation. And if you can get it to be repeatable, then it truly is a scientific operation.
Now, Stephen, I know that you have written books on Greco-Egyptian magic. I know that you've also written books on the life of Dr. John Dee, who is one of the more popular magicians that we know from the Renaissance period. Have you found there to be a singular thread of methodology or a singular thought that bridge the gap essentially between magic, both ancient and more modern. And by modern, I'm referring to John Dee, even though I know for us he's not modern. But have you found a thread between that magic of the ancient Greco-Egyptian period, and have you seen that being bridged with the magic that was being practiced by Dr. John Dee?
Yep, the actual methods of the magic have been virtually unchanged. The words have changed because it's not in ancient Greek anymore. It'll be in Latin or it'll be in English. Um, but for example, one of the papyri that I've read from the second century, written in Koine Greek, had a method which I found also in a 16th century manuscript, which I also then replicated and found that it worked. So yes, there is this bridge through from from Greco-Egyptian times onwards. Can't go back much further earlier than Greco-Egyptian. And the reason why I stopped there is because of the large amount of documentation. And the same is true of John Dee. He had a scientific framework, mode of thinking. He recorded everything, incredible boring detail. And he recorded his failures as well as his successes. And this is the mark of a great man. He didn't just say, I did all these things and they turned out terrifically. Like I predicted the Armada and I got the date approximately right and so forth. But he also recorded his failures. And he recorded when the spirits, or as he referred to them, angels, told him lies, and when they told him the truth, because they're not quite as perfect as they're made out to be. So I've been fascinated by people who recorded their experiences honestly. I try to keep my records in the same way. But the actual techniques is to call the spirit, to bind the spirit, to order it to do something. In Dee's case, he was a little bit more religious, and so he called them angels. He really wanted mostly information, although every now and then he also, I suspect, wanted gold or other help.
Now, Stephen, the specific thing that we're going to be speaking about this evening is geomancy. And before we even dive into the body of that conversation, can you give our listeners and viewers your definition of what geomancy is?
Yeah, it's a form of divination. Nowadays, you have the tarot, you have the Chinese I Ching, and astrology is also, in a sense, a form of divination. But what most people don't realize is that after astrology, geomancy was the most popular form of divination during the Renaissance. And all sorts of people kept geomantic notes in their diaries or whatever. People like Foreman or Dee would have used it. And in those days, some people refer to it as the daughter of astrology, which just ties it into what you've been doing. And that is slightly true, but anyway. So what is geomancy? So geomancy originated in North Africa, and it originated from divining by marking points in the sand, of which there's an awful lot in North Africa, and then adding up the points and working out from these certain figures, which they call the four mothers, and then from that coming up with an answer. And although it looks mechanical and it's to do with dots, by putting it together, you get a little bit of history as to what's happening, and you'll get a very clear answer. It's not the tarot. You've got to practice to interpret the cards and get it worked out. Geomancy will tell you at the bottom, this is a great idea, this is not a good idea, don't do this, you'll finish up in jail, or things like that. It's very concrete about its answers. So I don't consult geomancy for clients. I consult feng shui for clients. But I do use geomancy to get straightforward answers to simple questions. When I want a black and white answer, should I do this or should I not do that? Geomancy is quite a good way to go.
Stephen, I find that fascinating that geomancy, like you said, was the second most popular thing that was practiced in the Renaissance in terms of this divinatory relationship to the divine after astrology. Because as a lot of us look back to the Renaissance and reclaim the practices of the Renaissance astrologer, for the most part, we don't find this rich retelling of geomancy when we look back in the books of Renaissance astrologers. We don't really see this clear a connection, but it is there because at the same time as astrologers were writing their books, geomancers were also writing their books. And I think what's interesting about the Renaissance period is that as you look at the books of the geomancers and the attributions they list, and also look at the books of the astrologers and the attributions they list, it's clear that the two of them were reading each other, or that one person was probably reading another person's book far too closely because the language sounds very similar. So I guess what I wanted to know from you, Stephen, is why do you think geomancy has not been as popular as astrology in terms of its movement through time towards the 21st century?
Okay, it's a bit of a mystery to me why geomancy fell out of favor. If you look back, you can see that people like Christopher Catan were writing books about it. Um, if you look on the bookshelves, perhaps at the what used to be the British Museum, now the British Library, you can see there are in fact quite a lot of books about it. But it sort of disappeared in the 1800s, only to be dug up again by the Golden Dawn, who uses it as almost a training method. And then it disappeared again. Aleister Crowley did a booklet on it, but then nothing until the end of the 20th century when people started writing about it again. It's a practical method, but I think that astrology wins out because astrology is personal. People love to see what is my character, what was I born with. Sometimes I go, well, if you don't know your character, why are you coming to me to ask? And what's going to happen to me? So astrology is better on things like that, but geomancy will answer questions. You can't look at your chart and say, should I go out to the game today? Should I take this job offer? Should I take this wife? You know, astrology won't answer that. Although actually, with the last question, you can use synastry to check her chart against your chart, but then you will know that. So, and I suppose the other thing is that astrology got itself regular columns in the newspapers, whereas geomancy never did. And so astrology has been sort of forefront. But you know, these changes in history over time, it's quite often difficult to say why they happened. At one point, geomancy was used for political decisions, like some of the weavers' disputes and so forth. People did geomantic charts to solve them. But anyway, so geomancy and astrology do fit together because once you've drawn up the geomantic chart, you can then overlay astrological interpretations on it. So like you say, I'm sure the geomancers are reading the astrology books and the astrologers are reading the geomancy books. But the two then parted, and God knows why.
I can't remember whose book I was reading from the Renaissance, and I feel as if it was Hayden. And in the opening to his book on geomancy is a foreword by a very well-known Renaissance astrologer by the name of John Gadbury. And I was floored to find John Gadbury writing a foreword to a book on geomancy because I've studied John Gadbury for so long, and nowhere within the context of those studies have I even seen him mentioning the word geomancy. And then to see him write such a warm and heartfelt introduction to the subject, it showed me that, okay, these people did know each other.
When you look in some of the diaries, you know, people like Ashmole knew almost, he's not Renaissance, he's after Renaissance, but he knew pretty well everybody involved in astrology, involved in magic, involved in all of these more ancient arts. When you get to the sort of late 1600s, a lot of the scientists also who established the Royal Society, they also knew the magicians. You know, like Isaac Newton, he's well known as a physicist and a mathematician, but in terms of tonnage, he wrote more stuff about prophecy and alchemy than he did about physics and mathematics. And a nice little irony of that is that when his notebooks came out for sale, the libraries in the UK bought all his mathematical and so forth. They didn't bid for the alchemical ones, and they have now finished up in a library in Jerusalem, which is a bit of a weird thing. But he was just as serious about that. So the interest in magic was just as great as his interest in gravity or momentum or whatever else, because he wanted to know how things worked, which has indeed been the driving force for me. I do want to know how it worked. I don't want to know just historically that this happened or may have happened. I want to know why it happened and how it happened. And Gadbury, yes, he was one of the political astrologers. So during the time, I suppose, the only English civil war, during the time of Cromwell, when you had the monarchy being abolished, Charles I's head being cut off, that's pretty solid sort of abolition. You had astrologers working for the royalists saying that the king will be restored or Charles II will come or whatever, and you had astrologers working for the Commonwealth proving from the stars that the reverse is true. So as you know, there's one or two bits of astrology which also haven't survived too well until the present time, which is using the horoscope of the present moment to determine the answer to a question. And that has sort of fallen out of favor. But it was heavily used by a lot of people at that time. And I haven't got back into it myself because I still can't intellectually see what is the connection between the second I thought of the question and the answer. But it seems to work for some people.
Well, I'm a practicing Hoary astrologer within the tradition of William Lilly and John Gadbury, and I teach Hoary astrology as well. And for me, Hoary astrology, it works very much within the same paradigm or philosophical structure as any other system of divination, which is that this moment is impregnated with the potencies of the answer to whichever question you have. And I have a bit of a theory about how all of the systems of divination work together, which is another discussion for another day. But the Hoary moment, I feel, holds within itself this seed of meaning or the seed of an answer that is reflected within the chart at that moment when you actually say the question, because it's not enough for you to have a question within yourself as a person who doesn't know how to interact with the astrology of the moment. You actually have to bring in the astrologer as the diviner, as the second person in that relationship, if you can't do it for yourself. And when you say that question to the diviner or to the hoary astrologer, that serves as the birth of that question. And the moment of that question holds within itself the answer. But I think that that moment is the same as the geomantic moment, or it's the same as the moment of tarot, or
Yeah.
this moment of divination. I think it's the same straight across the field, because if you cast a horary chart for the same moment that you cast a geomantic figure or that you cast a hexagram, all of them airily have the exact same answer straight across the field.
That is very true. The moment you lay the cards, the way you shuffle them, the moment you decide to stop shuffling. Um, But I think that nowadays people don't respect time in the sense of the specialness of a particular moment. Um, Ever since clocks were invented, people are now, they just look at the number on their watch. But in the past, time had special meanings, like every day was allocated to a particular planet. Inside that day, every hour was allocated to the planet, one of the seven planets. But it wasn't the clock time, it was the planetary time. And the planetary time was measured from sunrise to sunset. Take the number of minutes divided by 12, and that gives you the length of the hours. Now, where we live on the equator, the planetary times are pretty regular. They're pretty close to a real hour. But if you go up to, say, England or even further north, then in summer, the daylight hours are much longer than 60 minutes, and the night hours are much shorter. In winter, the reverse is true. And that works from a human point of view. If you are in winter and it's cold and unpleasant outside, the daylight hours are shorter, and you work shorter amounts of time, and the night hours are longer, and so forth. So there was respect for the relationship between time and nature. Whereas now, oh, you're working from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock. It doesn't matter whether it's dark or freezing cold. You don't finish till 5 o'clock. You and I have the advantage of, I imagine you've got sunrise and sunset, 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. And this is all very reliable problems. But yeah, respect for time has gone. So the essence of a particular hour is gone. Even the church understood that because it had prayers at certain times. And these were measured by planetary hours, they were not measured by clock time. And so in winter, the daylight prayers would be shorter. Because you want to go back to bed or you want to go somewhere warm, and so on. Okay, enough about time.
Okay, Stephen. Now, a question that I have that's a technical question before we even go into the actual practice of geomancy is that as we look at the works of medieval geomancers and Renaissance geomancers, and even sometimes medieval geomancers within the same body of work, we find that there is this plurality of meanings that is sometimes maddening. And the specific example I'm thinking about is Henry Cornelius Agrippa in his book on geomancy, or the section of his book on geomancy in which he talks about geomancy, and it's wonderful for the first few pages. Okay, every question that I can possibly ask, it can be answered via this geomantic method. It's really lovely, and I feel as if I'm moving into something that's going to ground me in something solid. But then you reach about 3 pages in, and you have this first list of attributions that these geomantic figures, they are associated with these planets. But here's another way, and here's another way. And if you don't like any of those two ways, here's this other way. Oh, and did I mention this final way? So on that same page, he produces several different ways of giving attributions to the 16 geomantic figures. That is really, where do we go with that? And then when you read Christopher Catan, he says something different. And then when you reach Hayden, he says something different. So, how do we extract from antiquity a singular geomantic body of wisdom that can be taught with certainty?
The actual meaning of the figures is very cut and dried, even when you look at their meaning in North African Ramal, their meaning in Ifa, their meaning in Malagasy, they are still the same. Fortuna Major is always major fortune. It's never a bad thing, it's always a good thing. Fortuna Minor is just exactly as it sounds, not as good, but it's still good. And then Kaka, or Casa if you like, is a prison. And there's no two ways you can interpret that as a happy birthday or a good journey or anything else. Via is a journey. That is also Do I need to travel to this new job? You get via, you know that the answer is yes. That's very clear. But the interface between these figures and astrology is a little bit more difficult. I mean, it's obvious that the major fortunes are going to be the positive planets like the sun or the positive zodiacal signs. Now, the cheapskate answer is that if you are learning from a particular person, he will give you the oral answer to how it should be. But really, that'll only be his selection of which particular system. So I tried in my book on geomancy to tabulate these as a way of getting them under control, but it still didn't tell me which one was the perfect one. But I have found from practice that one set of attributions makes more sense regularly than others. A third answer is, oh, it depends on the circumstance, but I hate that answer because I like to have things like you, cut and dried and exact.
Okay, so I think the main thing that I'm getting from what you're saying is that if you find a system that works through a particular author or through a particular teacher, and you essentially dedicate yourself to those attributions will work for you by virtue of the fact that it's still a spiritual practice. Therefore, if you say to the universe, hey, universe, this is what we're doing, then the universe will provide you answers via that specific framework. Does that feel like it?
This is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is the more scientific one, which is you work out your answers according to this scheme of astrological associations, and then you try it with the other one, and you see which one comes up more correctly, more frequently. And so from practice, from test, from experimentation, you figure out which one is the one that works. Whether that's a question of it's the one that works for me or the one that works for you, or it's the one that's universally correct, that's another argument, and that'll take us down a few other rabbit holes.
So now, Stephen, can you talk to us a bit about geomancy in practice? What can it be used for? How can it be used? And is it always associated with the astrological components, or is there a geomancy that we can practice that's free of that?
Yeah, the initial geomancy was probably free of that. Um, if you look on the cover of my book on geomancy, which I think you probably got lying on your desk, um, the illustration on the front cover is of two groups of people. One group of guys looking up at the sky and then measuring planetary distances and things. And the other guys are poking the sand with sticks, and what looks like Arabic words are emanating from the end of the sticks. So you can see that the two systems are quite actually different, but one can reinforce or add color to the other one. So geomancy is cut and dried. It's a very binary system. You could say it's even a slightly colorless system. Whereas, for example, the tarot is an infinite richness, which is lovely in one way, but in another way, if you just want, well, do I do it or not? And then you've got to look at half a dozen cards and figure out what you do. My wife with tarot sometimes will just pull one card, and that's her way of do I do it or not. But anyway, going back to geomancy. So although it's separate from astrology, you can then overlay it with astrology. But you could leave the astrology aside and just use pure geomancy to get binary answers, or even quite surprisingly subtle binary answers. Like as you work the figures down, you finally come to a figure at the end, which is two witnesses, and then you combine them and they form a judge. And then there's also a super judge. So you can look at the judge, there's your answer. And it's pretty clear cut one way or the other. It'll be Tristitia or Letitia, it'll be happiness or it'll be sadness. these are the sort of answers that you want if it's a practical question. But then you can look back one step at the two witnesses and see what was it that contributed to that happiness. And that gives you a certain richness. Then if you want to overlay the planet, etc., it becomes a lot more complicated. But some people like complicated systems. I quite like a binary system, which gives me a straight answer to a straight question. The other thing about divination, which I'm sure you'll agree with me, is that half the battle is enunciating the question clearly in a way that does not allow for any ambiguity. You know, like I can see you identify with that. I had somebody, you know, how will this year turn out for me? Well, that is not a good question. It's, will I succeed in my job this year? Now that is a bit more clear. Will I specifically get this particular promotion this year? That's much clearer. And by going back to what you said about the time, the moment of the question, if the question is enunciated clearly, then the divinatory apparatus has no right to give you a confusing answer, and will frequently not give you a confusing answer. It will give you a very clear answer. Of course, you don't want to run your entire life by divining every day. Aleister Crowley, for example, when he was in Italy and also in North Africa, he used to cast Yijing hexagram every day to see what would happen today. Am I going to have a good lunch? You know, what is it going to is the sun going to shine or something? In the case of Tunisia, the answer is always yes. You don't want to do that. You don't want to wear it out or you out or become dependent on a crutch. But when you've got a really serious problem that you need an answer to, and there's no logical way of calculating which is the best route, then this use of geomancy or tarot is an excellent way to get a clear answer. And the third one, of course, is the I Ching. And that has an extra level of subtlety because it tells you what is the correct thing to do. Like it will say, you know, these are the circumstances, but the superior man will do this, that, the other. The superior man being a sort of code word for the right course of action, which will not necessarily be the one that you'll do or even the one that you want to do, but it's useful to know what is the correct course of action. And I've frequently had my course of action adjusted by reading a I Ching divination. And the other thing, there's a sort of subjective test. Quite often you will get an answer and it will fit the circumstances perfectly, and then you know you've got it. And then there's no doubt that what you've got. But if you get an answer which doesn't seem to fit the circumstances, then maybe you should do it again or at a different time, or you should do more preparation, or maybe you should use logic instead.
Stephen, I agreed with you so deeply when you spoke about the question because, as you very well know, those of us who practice divination of any sort for clients, it is a struggle to get people to specifically narrow down their question. And oftentimes people think that they are very certain about what their question is, but it's still this ambiguous and this very fluctuating thing. And something that I've said to clients for years is that this practice or this divinatory apparatus will be as clear with you as you are with it. So
So, so
if
true.
you come forward with confusion, then it will give you something that makes no sense to either me, the diviner, or you, the querent. But if you come forward with a specific question, then your specific question will ring true within the cosmos, and the apparatus will give you back a very specific and tight woven answer.
Definitely. And this is not psychological. There is a certain objectivity to this. There's no way a pack of cards or poke holes in the sand can read your mind. But like you say, it's grabbed the essence of the answer for that period, and it'll reply in the same degree of specificity as you have asked the question. The same applies to magic. It's no use asking a spirit, oh, can you smooth my way for the next 6 months or something? you need to ask for something specific, and you need to put a time frame on it, and you need to lock it into doing it in a certain way. So one of the great ironies of the history of magic is that in the 16th and 17th century, some of the best known angel magicians were also lawyers. They knew how to draw up contracts, they knew how to give a specific question and put a framework around it. You know, I don't want this, I don't want that, you must do this or that. And these guys are very successful. And when I say lawyers, I mean the master of the rolls, which is the highest position you could have in the legal setup in the UK, and the Lord of the Admiralty both used angel magic and also the divinatory methods we're talking about to run their lives. These are very successful men.
It is really interesting and amazing every time we look back into the 16th century, the 17th century, we see this deep intrigue that people have regarding the magical tradition. And I think it's really fascinating also that people who you would consider upstanding citizens of society were the people who were going to the seances. They were the people who were practicing magic downstairs in their basement. These were the people who also held on to a very left brain, sort of socially correct, politically correct thing that they did within society. But they also had this very mystical and magical component to their lives that enriched them and it actually gave them value.
Mm. And gave them answers which they needed. And so that magic and divination and so forth was not connected with losers. It was connected with people who were quite successful. And that is also true today for those who are doing it properly.
Wonderful. Now, Stephen, the final question that I have for you has to do with geomancy as a magical practice, because as we look into the geomancy texts of antiquity, we find, yes, geomancy for divination, but we also find the geomancy running parallel with the magic of the times as well. So, can you comment on geomancy as a practice or as a system of magic within itself?
It's a system of divination, not of magic. So forgive me for saying this, but there's a clear difference between the two. Divination hopes to find out what's going to happen. Magic makes the changes and makes it happen. One is passive and one is active. So when we talk about geomancy, Crowley tried to associate it with spirits of the earth, etc. But really, it is a passive asking of questions. And it started out with North Africans poking the sand with a stick and wondering, by counting up the holes that they've absent-mindedly poked, what the answer might be. It then became much more specific in Egypt, for example, where a lot of Arab mathematics was applied to it, because it's really a binary arithmetic problem. And then not many people have heard of it, but they actually made geomantic machines, and these were beautifully crafted pieces done in brass, where you dial in the information, number of points, dial here, number of second line points, dial here, and so forth. And it will turn up the answer in a small little window at the bottom, coming out in brass. So it became machine-like, but again, it's passive. It's not making changes to life, it's determining what is going to happen. But nothing is absolutely set in concrete. And so if you get an answer you don't like, you can then apply magic to change it. But that's a whole different conversation.
So it isn't that the geomancy within itself serves the purpose at any level to actually effect a magical change, but it's that the entire corpus of geomancy is divinational. And if you want to apply magic for the purpose of affecting the outcome or smoothing the way forward, essentially, to allow that outcome to happen or to prevent a malefic outcome from happening, you can do it post the actual geomantic act, but they're
Correct.
two separate things.
Yes. There's only one place on the world where the two were melded into a system, and that's in Madagascar. Because the Arab traders came down the east coast of Africa and they brought with them what they call Kat al Ramal, which is the Arabic word for geomancy. And then Malaysian traders came from this part of the world across to Madagascar, and they brought a system of magic. And the local Sikadi readers combined the two. But that was a rare moment in history. Normally, magic is one thing, divination is the other. You use the divination to find out what's going to happen, use the magic to change what's going to happen.
Beautifully stated. And when you use that word Ramal, Stephen, I'm reminded that in India, in the Vedic tradition, they have a system of astrology essentially that they call Ramal astrology, which is geomancy. They have this rectangular device that has the different dots on it to make the geomantic figure. And I think that I've seen quite a few people in India practicing what they call Ramal, but what essentially sounds like it is the same geomancy that we're referring to.
Well, given that the Mughals invaded India, the Mughals would have had access to these through the Muslim world. So it's quite possible that that's the way it came into India. But thanks for the hint. I didn't realize that that could be part of Vedic or post-Vedic astrology. Interesting.
Well, it definitely is. And I think that the thing with Vedic astrology is that it unashamedly puts different things onto itself from everywhere. So there's a numerology that's been grafted onto Vedic astrology. There's an entire system of locational relationships, their Vastu tradition that's been grafted within the larger Vedic astrology system. And there's also this geomancy that there are several colleges of astrology in India that teach this Ramal astrology, but it is fundamentally at its core geomancy.
Okay, interesting. That looks like something I need to follow up. Um,
Well, I'm definitely willing to have another conversation with you when you do to see what you think would be the parallels between that and the geomancy that actually came from antiquity that we call Western geomancy today.
yeah, I mean, the origin is probably around about the 9th century in North Africa, and Ramal was definitely the word. And as Ramal is also an Arabic word, I'm pretty sure that the Vedic Ramal is the same word and probably spelled the same way. So, but then geomancy has gone across the world. Like it went across to the Americas. Is part of the Apili divination from Africa down in Dahomey. And that went across, and that was also a binary system. And they had a cowrie shell, 16 cowrie shells on a chain, and the way they throw it on the ground determines the geomantic figure. So it had a huge spread, which is just very weird that for a couple of centuries it seemed to disappear in Europe.
But what do you see is the space for geomancy in the future, or what would you like to see for geomancy as we move forward towards the future?
Well, I'd certainly like to see more people using it. The same also goes for astrology. I'm glad that the world is turning away from the 12 columns in the Sunday newspaper and moving towards the stuff that, say, Christopher Warnock is doing. You're talking about Hoary Astrology. I didn't even use the word because I thought most people had never heard of Hoary Astrology. But it was a significant tool. And my thing is, if it's a tool and it works, it needs to be taped down. The rules need to be set out. It needs to be tested, and then it needs to be published, and then people need to use it. So much knowledge is lost because the book's been burned. Somebody dies, and his relatives throw his notebooks away. Fortunately, a lot of them finished up in some libraries like the Bodleian and the British Library. I'm talking about magic here specifically, the largest collection of Western books on magic in the British Library and the Bodleian. And thank God they still are there. But not many people can read them because a lot of them are in Latin. Just going back to something we said a little bit earlier, when I wanted to investigate Greco-Egyptian magic, because as far as I could see, that was the earliest consistently documented system. It was all written in Koine Greek, ancient Greek. So I set myself the task of learning Greek, which I can tell you, it's not as bad as Sanskrit, but God, it's much worse than most languages, because it has many, many tenses, it has many this, it has many that. The Greeks are actually highly intelligent because the language is very complicated because you can express subtlety. Whereas some other languages, like for example Bahasa, is very simple. There's no plurals even in Bahasa. Anyway, going back to it, so I put my brain to the strain of learning it, but it was worthwhile because then I could actually read it in the way the Greeks had read it and find which techniques worked and which didn't work. And in the Greek it says, and this one is a tested method. It means that the person who copied it out actually tried it and it worked. So again, it's a scientific approach. It's not woo-woo. It's time people stop thinking about magic as that, or thinking about it as a psychological method, because that's mysticism. You kind of keep mysticism, magic, and divination in separate boxes. The whole New Age tendency is, let's mess it all up together. Let's mess angels and tarot cards and God knows what else. And maybe you'll get clarity. No, you will not. You'll just get confusion. Or you will get personalized views, which are not universal and are not applicable to you and me and somebody else. I want methods which are applicable to anybody. You can go in and you can do it. And if you do it right, then it works.
Can you tell us about the books that you have written and also any upcoming titles that you have, and where can we find your work should our listeners and viewers want to dive more deeply into the work that you've done?
Okay, so most of my work on magic and divination is now published by Golden Horde. Golden Horde, Horde is spelled H-O-A-R-D, as in a chest of worthwhile things, goldenhorde.com. And you can order from there, but in these COVID times, when transport is not always that simple, and people have to use couriers rather than the post because the post doesn't work anymore. A better choice probably, if you're in America, would be Amazon.com, who carry most of my works. If I can just quickly wave the Geomancy book in the air, and that's the illustration I was talking about earlier, where here you've got astronomers looking at the sky, measuring the angles of the stars. And here you have Geomancers poking in the sand, literally, is what they do. Nowadays, of course, you use a piece of paper and a pencil and you quickly, rapidly dot in dots, and you do 16 lines of that or as many as you like, and you go back and count. So, so Amazon is pretty good. I'm not plugging Jeff Bezos, good luck to him, but actually he still provides access to my books. In America, Llewellyn also distributes books. Llewellyn is sometimes thought of as a rather new age publisher, but as far as I'm concerned, they're a very efficient distributor, so we love what they do there. And my website is sskinner.com, and that shows some of the other things that I do and I'm interested in. In all, I've written more than 46 books, and I don't mean small ones. I mean books that run to 400 or 500 pages each. And I've spent many, many hours poring over manuscripts and so forth in libraries. I hope I haven't had a misspent youth, or indeed a misspent life, because in the end, I think these methods, which were in danger of disappearing in this modern materialistic world, are useful and valuable, and you can figure out things using divinatory methods like geomancy, which you wouldn't otherwise be able to figure out. We all need a bit of help in this day and age. And with magic, you can make changes that you wouldn't normally have thought even possible. And on another day, I can tell you some of the experiments I've carried out and some of the some quite surprising results that I've got. But that's not part of this conversation. So that's how you can get hold of my books. So I guess that's about it.
Stephen, I am so grateful to be able to have shared this space with you. And I am going to put your contact information down in the description box below so that our listeners and viewers can dive more deeply into your work. Because from my perspective and from the bottom of my heart, I can tell you that your youth has not been wasted. And your life surely hasn't, because I appreciate your work so very much. And I appreciate your erudition and the level of depth and clarity and sincerity that you've invested into it, because we need more solid, magical texts from people who actually have the ability to conduct not only the research into what went before, but who also have the passion to apply those methods now. And you, Stephen, have done both of those things. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your contribution to all of us through your practice.
Well, while we're throwing compliments around, may I say that I've enjoyed being interviewed by you because you know what I'm talking about, so I don't have to tediously explain the footprints leading to what our discussion has been. So thank you, I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. And to our listeners and viewers out there, if this is your 100th time joining us here on the Oraculos True Divination podcast, or if this is your time number one, I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming and sharing in this virtual, mystical, and magical space with us. I receive your comments, I receive your feedback, I receive your encouragement, but most importantly, I receive your love. So if you want to continue to be a part of the magic and the momentum that we're building here on the Oraculos True Divination podcast, please do, yes, go down below and like this video, but also subscribe to the True Divination podcast and share this wonderful conversation on geomancy with your other astrological, mystical, and magical friends, because more and more people need to know about these amazing conversations that we're having with these amazing practitioners from around the world. So until next time, I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, wishing you lots of love, lots of peace. Be well, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye. Stephen Skinner.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I'm talking to somebody who understands these things.